All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so happy that you guys were able to join us tonight. My name is Clarice Wheeler. I'm the Southern Nevada Programs Coordinator for Friends of Nevada Wilderness. And yeah, I'm really happy to see everybody here. Before we get started, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that here in Southern Nevada and in Reno, where our speaker is from, we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Southern Paiute Nuwuvi people, as well as the Northern Paiute and the Washoe people. What is now called Nevada is home to 27 federally recognized tribes of Indigenous peoples. These people are the original stewards of the land and continue to care for our precious natural places to this day. I'd like to invite you to take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization and how they have brought you and all of us here today. So for those of you who might be new to our speaker series, Friends of Nevada Wilderness is a statewide nonprofit focused on protecting wild lands. Wilderness areas are natural landscapes that are largely unaffected by people, and we protect these lands in a few main ways. So we advocate by speaking up for these lands to get them permanently protected and managed to maintain their wildness. We educate by sharing the values and vision of wilderness at community events, presentations just like this one, and finding the common ground to protect our wildland heritage. And we steward. Because these lands cannot protect themselves, we work with volunteers on the ground to help monitor, restore, and improve access to these special places. We hold this Wild Speaker Series every first Thursday of the month by hosting a local environmental expert for people who are interested in learning more about the outdoors and ways to get involved with conservation efforts. Now let me introduce you to our speaker. Tonight we are joined by Daniel Rothberg. Daniel is an environmental reporter for the Nevada Independent, which is a nonprofit newsroom covering policy and politics. His work focuses on water, public land, and climate change. Daniel's writing about groundwater issues in the Great Basin has been recognized by the Society of Professional Journalists, the Nevada Press Association, and the Society of Environmental Journalists. Some housekeeping notes before we jump in. Please keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking. If we begin to have any bandwidth issues, I'm going to turn off everybody's cameras just so that our speaker can come through clearly. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and then either we'll address them at the end of the presentation, or maybe Daniel will decide to address them throughout the presentation. We will see how that goes. And then with that, I'll pass it off to you, Daniel.
Cool, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. I'm gonna share my screen. I am used to asking questions, not giving presentations. So I am definitely looking forward to answering questions. And if you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat. And as I said, I prepared kind of a presentation for a little while, but I would love to answer any questions. So as they come up or afterward, I'm sure there'll be some time for that afterward. So yeah, I'm talking about a topic that's near and dear to me, which is journalism, and specifically environmental journalism in Nevada. And I have a nice serious photo of myself doing journalism. And I picked this photo because even though we're a virtual newsroom at the Indy, this captures very well the diet of a journalist, which is a lot of coffee and snacks. I just briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the stories I've worked on and some of, what I think is unique about reporting on these issues in Nevada. But I also want to talk just a little bit about my approach to journalism and communicating some of these issues. I think that in many ways, this is kind of a cliche, I guess, and sort of intuitive, but when I think about why journalism is important and why communicating these issues are important I think you're sort of bringing light to a space. And I know that sounds like something every journalist says. It's in every journalism movie and in the popular culture, but the way that our journalism kind of industry is structured doesn't always lend itself to doing this. A lot of journalism is concentrated in big metro areas, New York, DC, LA, and a lot of journalists are covering the same stories really, and shining light on issues that already have a huge spotlight on them. And I think the importance of local journalism really is to highlight issues that are undercovered and underreported, but are often just as or more important than some of those issues that are already getting a lot of attention, whether that's on social media or in the national news. I also see journalism as an important, document and a mirror to kind of our world. It helps readers witness what's going on and offers insight into kind of the systems that affect our everyday lives and our environment and the world around us. This can be extremely complicated to navigate as a journalist, because on one hand, you want to mirror the systems and provide information about what's going on. But, I think as everybody on this call can probably, or on this Zoom can acknowledge, our systems are extremely imperfect. And I think the last couple of years have really highlighted that. So I think our job as journalists also is to sort of expose that and not only put up a mirror to our systems, but show how our systems are not working all the time. And I think that ties into the third point, which, of importance of journalism that I see, is that it provides accountability. And I think that this is, a really important part of the work that I try to do at the Nevada Independent, and the work that we do at the Nevada Independent is to provide accountability for public for public actors and agencies and the government, and then also for private companies and for enterprises that have a lot of sway in our society today. And I think there are many examples outside of the context of environmental issues where private corporations and businesses, whether it's insurance companies or Amazon, have a lot of power. So I think that's where I really see journalism coming in, and it's especially important in the context of public land, where you have a lot of different interests coming together to ultimately make decisions about how a public resource is managed. I also want to sort of just give a little context of where I kind of see our industry right now. I don't think this comes as a surprise to anyone, but I do try to, what I say all the time is I really don't see, journalists for years and years have competed. We still compete. We all like to get the story first. But I actually really try not to see my work that way. I try to see it as more collaborative, because at the end of the day, there are way more stories out there than there are journalists to cover them, especially in local and statewide news. As I mentioned, the media industry is really concentrated in big metro areas, and that creates a lot of news deserts. That's a photo of the Desert Wildlife Refuge. There's a need for more local reporters, and we are catching up. There's a lot of, I think, emphasis, especially over the last few years, especially during the coronavirus, on local news. And I think it's highlighted for a lot of people the importance of local news, but we aren't catching up, in my opinion, fast enough. And I wish there were, 10 environmental reporters at least in the state, if not more. If I had my wish, that would be it. So the hardest part of my job by far is saying no to stories. There are so many stories I want to do, and I have a really long list of stories. Um, I also wanted to just briefly, and I think about this a lot, like what made me interested in reporting on environmental issues, especially the topics that I tend to gravitate to, which include water and energy. And I think what really motivated me is sort of just the fact that these are all systems that we kind of interact with on a daily basis for our sustenance. I mean, water is life, and yet for most of us, where our water comes from is completely invisible and hidden, and we have no idea. And these are photos I took. It was either earlier this year or last year, just driving along a 395 from Southern California, which is where I'm originally from, up to Reno. And here's Mono Lake. I'm not sure if that's the Los Angeles Aqueduct, but the photo on the right, at least on my right, looking at the screen, definitely is outside of the Owens Valley. And I as I mentioned, I grew up in Southern California. I always had a sense that we were in a drought. My mom was really big in conserving water, and yelling at us if we were taking showers for too long. But I didn't really have a good sense of where our water was coming from and the impacts of that on the environment and on the communities that live in the areas where all this water is being imported from: the Colorado River, the Delta, the Eastern Sierra. And I think that I think so. I think what really interests me is kind of what we don't see about these systems. And I think it's really important that people understand how we fit into them and how decisions are made, and about what are essentially public resources but have been appropriated for different uses. And that's what really motivates me. I think that, especially when it comes to writing about water, it's so integral to daily life, and yet we just turn on the tap, we just turn on the light switch, but we don't really know where that energy is coming from and what the impacts are. The same is true more recently on some of my reporting on mining and the supply chain. Where are these minerals coming from? What are the impacts on these lands? For me, like, another just personally motivating factor is I just am really curious. When I was a kid, I never really liked when people told me that there was no answer, or the answer was too complicated. People say that to kids a lot. That was always very frustrating to me, because I was like, I'm here. I'm happy to learn. And so that's, at the heart of every story is really a lot of questions. It's basically that simple. And I think for me, what I try to do is kind of wipe out my sort of assumptions and what I'm told the narrative is, and just ask and really continue to dig until I get an answer. And then take that information and try to condense it down for a general audience. I also, when I was thinking about this, I realized my approach varies a lot depending on what kind of story I'm doing. There's all sorts of different kinds of stories that can be done on environmental issues, and also just on really any news topic in general. So, there are breaking news stories, which we call spot news. There are daily stories, which are sort of your overnight stories that you typically see. Features that are kind of more in depth, and then investigative stories. And I also have a newsletter. There's more and more newsletters in the industry. And all those stories have slightly different approaches. So, I mean, today I'm mostly talking about my more in-depth investigative kind of feature work, which is where I really like to focus most of my time. But I just wanted to throw out the caveat that there's all sorts of different ways to approach journalism, and my reporting approach varies quite a bit depending on what kind of stories I'm working on. A question I get a lot from people I'm interviewing or people I'm talking to is, where do your stories come from? And I would say there's a lot of different buckets where a story might come from. You know, sometimes just going out into the world, observations and following up, just everyday life. Like I'll see something, while I'm out on a hike or on the street, and I will be like, that's kind of an interesting thing. Why is that? I think just asking questions, and then sources really in the broadest sense of the term. Like, again, I get a lot of stories just from having conversations with friends, just from talking to people. And then I get, I didn't do a great job on this slide because there's like 3 more buckets I want to mention, but I get a lot of stories from documents. And then I get a lot of stories just from sort of what I would say is kind of the inertia of the job. Like I will do one story and then there's some stuff from one story that I couldn't quite include in another story, and I'll try to follow up on it at a later date. But tips, sources, and a lot is me just trying to kind of understand the issues that I'm covering, and I have a question about it. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, but I might have a question about like why why Las Vegas is, like a Las Vegas water question, for example, like why, what is the math of why we all know Lake Mead is so low, but like, what is the math of that? Where is the water going out of Lake Mead? And why is there sort of this imbalance? And the answer to that is just way more complicated than, people are using water and there's not enough water coming in. Like that is certainly true, but there's all sorts of things that go into that equation, like evaporative loss and different things like that. So just sort of asking questions to better understand even the things that I'm covering is sort of sometimes how I'll come across a story. For me, though, once I have a kernel of an idea, especially with a feature story, I love research, and I sometimes have a pretty lengthy reporting process. And the photos here actually are, this is the Pershing County Courthouse, and those are some files I had to go view in person because they do not have electronic records that I know of. And so the reporting process for me is to really collect as much information as possible when I'm approaching a big story. I like to kind of think of it like I'm on a ship in the middle of the ocean, and I'm trying to kind of fill out the map around me. And I have like a periscope, and on one hand, I want to know like the kind of zoomed out version of where everything is, but then I also want to know like all of the details, and I want to zoom in as much as possible. So it's kind of that constant zooming in, zooming out. Where do these details fit into the larger story that I'm trying to tell? For me too, especially with some of these complicated land and water stories, I really think that it's important for journalists and for me in my own process to learn the history of where I am. And I mean that very specifically, because the truth is, even though we live in the same state, Las Vegas and Reno are in the same state, Elko is in the same state, all these places are in different watersheds. They're in, they have slightly different climates. They all have different characters and characteristics and characters. And they, even zooming in farther than that, like that, you can develop a very a very rich history of a very specific place. And I think it's really important to do that, to understand, we are talking about water rights, that are tied literally to this one specific place. How did they get to be here? What is the history of these rights? What is the history of this land? And that's really important to me. One example of that is, and I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about it, but I did a series on kind of groundwater development in Southern Nevada, looking at the Coyote Springs project, which is, outside of kind of the Apex Industrial Center. And I had to learn a lot about kind of the hydrological map underneath that area of land. And it's all these sort of connected aquifers, and there's an alluvial aquifer, and then there's the carbonate aquifer. And so it just required a lot of kind of history spatially, and then also in terms of the different ownership, because all of these water rights and all of this land had traded owners many different times. And so that's really important to me. And then reporting in the field as much as possible is really important. Conducting interviews, talking to people, listening to the stories, listening to reactions. With some stories, I almost feel like this is kind of like collecting oral histories or taking a testimony almost, because on any different topic, people will have different opinions, even people in the same group. And that's really important to me, to reflect in stories. I don't want it to just be this group says this group says that. I want to go even farther and get more specific. And then the whole process for me is sort of iterative. Like, I will do some reporting, then go back to some people, do some more research, and go back to some people. So my approach to environmental writing is, like I said, with history, context is key. I also think that specificity is really important. Details about the scope of different projects and the scope of an issue is really important. There's constant debates in my industry over objectivity, which we could totally have, for hours and hours and hours. The word that I like to use is fairness. I want to make sure my stories are fair. I want to make sure I've done due diligence, but I also don't want to fall into the two sides trap, that there always has to be two sides. Sometimes there aren't. Sometimes things are just the way that they are. There's not really two sides to climate change. The science says one thing. And so that's really important to me. So, but sometimes there's like three sides or four sides or five sides. So that's something I'm also cognizant of. And I think that came out a little bit in my reporting. I reported earlier or last year on the Thacker Pass mine. And there were a lot of, most of the people I talked to were opposed to the mine, or at the very least wary of it. But a lot of people had different reasons why. And it's important to me in a story like that to capture the different reasons. Another thing that I just try to think about when I'm doing interviews and transcribing interviews is to just reflect the voice and tone of the people that I'm talking to. I want to be respectful. And sometimes I'll do an hour-long, 2-hour-long interview with someone, and then I'll have to write, 200, 300 words. And I just try really hard in those 200, 300 words to reflect the voice and tone of the interview. And then just sort of kind of, again, going back to the system view, like what is changing, what could change, trying to leave people with a little bit more information there. Nevada is a really rich state to cover as an environmental journalist, I think. And every day I feel that more and more, because I'll do interviews and I think I've seen everything, and then I'll see something else that is new and unique and different. and I don't have to. I'm sure everybody in this audience knows, but these are some of the issues that I see kind of right now in Nevada. Nevada is 85% federal public land. Some of that land is inaccessible, military bases and things like that. Nevada is facing the pressures of population growth, while still being the driest state in the nation, and facing the impacts of climate change. Nevada, is one of the most biodiverse states, has a lot of endemic species, because of some of our extremes in habitat. And, a lot of rural Nevada is based on a natural resource economy. And that economy is facing different challenges and threats, and that plays out in my reporting as well. And I think that the reality with all of this is that there is conflict at the end of the day. I definitely get a lot of emails sometimes being like, criticizing me for focusing too much on conflict. Sometimes I get emails criticizing me for focusing too much on collaboration. But the reality is that there is conflict, and some of these issues, people are looking for win-wins, and sometimes it is possible to do that, I think. But the reality is that sometimes it's not a win-win situation. I think the water users on the Colorado River are finding that out right now to an extent. On a kind of a macro level, with different states wanting to develop their water rights, even as there's less water on the river. And I think for me as a journalist, it's important to just report what I'm hearing and to put that out there, and then let people do what they want with the information. I also, think that, thinking about this, really almost every story I cover is related to public land in some way. It might not always be the focus of my stories, but, water definitely is related to public land, whether we're talking about, the intersection between headwaters and wildfire, or watershed management for recreation or public purpose laws. Home building and urban sprawl, definitely related to public lands in the context of almost every city and town in Nevada. The reality is that public land kind of surrounds these areas, and that's why there are these public lands bills. And not only does public land surround these areas, there's like public land in holdings in a lot of cities and areas, and different leases. I'm all too familiar with our RPNP, recreation and public purpose leases, something like that. And then, energy is another big issue I cover. I actually started covering energy before I started covering water, when I worked at the Las Vegas Sun. And, transmission, solar siting, geothermal development, all of these have impacts, and all of these, almost in many, if not most cases, intersect with public lands, or are going to be sited on public land. Then mining, ranching, and farming often takes place on public land. Recreation, conservation, recreation is a huge one. I think that's a growing industry in Nevada. And I have tried to count, but almost every community I've gone to in Nevada has a gateway to Chukar country, or a gateway to I think Winnemucca has a sign that says gateway to the Pacific Northwest, but everywhere it's kind of promoting different recreational opportunities. And And then wildlife habitat protection. I think, public land is that is a huge role that public land managers play. I wrote this morning about the Dixie Valley toad being listed, and that is going to require consultation between the BLM and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I wanted to talk about a couple of the main stories that I cover. One is the Colorado River. And I think that this is going to be a really, really, really important story to watch over the next couple of years as Colorado River managers renegotiate the guidelines for operating the river, which are set to expire at the end of 2025, I believe. It's either at the end of 25. I should know this. It's either at the end of 2025 or 2026. I know that they'll need new guidelines. The federal government, I think I tried with these slides to kind of like highlight some of the main issues that I see pop up in these stories and other stories that I cover. And I think the federal government's role in managing public resources in Nevada and elsewhere is really big. And I think the Colorado River is one example where the Secretary of the Interior is the water master for the lower basin, which includes Nevada, Arizona, and California. And I think that there are a lot of water is really interesting to me because embedded in kind of our water law, and at least in Nevada's case, I'm not sure about other Western states, but I think it's similar, is this idea that water belongs to all the people of the state, that it is a public resource. And so I really think journalism around water is really important because the public should be able to provide input and have a role in the process of negotiating how water is used. And right now, the Colorado River is, I think, a good example and probably representative of what a lot of communities are going to be facing with climate change, which is, how do we want to allocate, how do we want to kind of use our water in a way that conforms with, the legal rules that have come before, but in a way that also can adapt to a future with less water, and in a way that can reflect our values. And in a lot of this decision making is about values at the end of the day, what we want to prioritize in our economy, what we want to prioritize in our daily life. And right now in the Colorado River, Native American tribes have rights to about 20% of the Colorado River, yet they have been shut out of past negotiations. And I think that there is a lot of like lip service that's being paid right now by states to bring tribes into the negotiating process for the river. But, I think it's still an open question as to whether states are going to follow through on their commitments. So I see that as one area where journalism can be really important. I think another area where it can be important with the Colorado River and with water in general is just addressing general misinformation about water, how water is used, where water goes, and, just sort of the legal framework around water rights. Next slide. Another story that I have been following is kind of growth in the Reno Tahoe area, specifically around the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center. And this truly has felt like a Nevada story. I'm going to spare you all the details, but for me, I started covering this kind of when I found out there was a water district in Reno Tahoe that was going to use eminent domain. But it got me really interested in how the role that the water district plays on the Truckee River, and the role that the industrial center plays on the Truckee River, because for people in Vegas, the industrial center is literally right on the Truckee River and has Truckee River water rights and has groundwater rights, and will now be using effluent from the treated effluent from the city of Reno for processed manufacturing water. So the industrial center really is becoming kind of a major player on the Truckee River. At the same time, it's sort of this private use of what is a public resource, and a very regulated public resource. And that intersection between private and public is really interesting to me, and where the lines kind of blur. That's what got me interested in this first story down here, a water district. And the headline pretty much sums it up. For years, a public water district blurred the line between business and government, with developers, brothel workers at the helm. You can read the story if you are more interested. In last year, I kind of got re-engaged in some of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center issues when I found out that blockchains, a cryptocurrency company that was proposing, with kind of it seemed the blessing of the governor's office, to create its own county, sort of inside Story County. And if you're going to make a county, you need water, and create a new city on the Truckee River, you need water. And I found out that they had purchased groundwater rights, far away groundwater rights, kind of 50 miles or so to the north, in and around the Black Rock Desert, which kind of immediately struck me for a few different reasons. One, they would need to pipe the water. And, I know all about NEPA, federal land issues, and that would be a big challenge. And then also the fact that this pipeline or pumped water would, have to go through the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe's land, and that groundwater pumping likely, and I'm not a hydrologist, but I know enough hydrologists that I can call them. And I also kind of generally, just knowing how the water flows in this area, thought that groundwater pumping would have impacts potentially on Pyramid Lake, certainly, probably, well, I shouldn't say certainly, but potentially around the potentially on the aquifers in the area. So that was a big focus of my story, was whether or not this company had reached out to the tribe, had done any kind of consultation, had any discussions, which it turned out they really hadn't, which was shocking to me. And it was shocking that the state hadn't either, because there is a government to government relationship. And that really, the story is not the biggest story in the world, but it highlighted for me a kind of intersection of water, of land, and of tribal water rights in particular, and the different level, the different kind of intersections of political lines. There's often local, there's state, there's federal, and tribal water, tribal governments involved. And actually, there had been a similar proposal to pipe this water in the past in, Washoe County, the BLM, Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe all protested those water rights. I also another area where I think my reporting really intersects with public lands is covering mining in the Great Basin, particularly public lands mining. And I think one thing that's really interesting to me here is, especially recently, as there's been more emphasis on mining lithium and some of these, critical minerals, and I put that in quotes because I don't always like to use that term because it seems like a somewhat political term. I'd rather just say what they are, minerals needed for batteries or electric vehicles. And it really reflects to me, which, has always been, I think, a tension with public land is this sort of the effect that kind of national priority, what is presented as a pressing national priority, can have very quickly on public land, especially especially on the agencies that manage land. So that's another thing that I think is going to be interesting to watch. In my reporting on mining, at least what I aim to do most is really try to elevate local voices, those impacted by mining. I saw one question here was about PR, and I really, whether it's from a mining company or from a group, the most important thing to me is to hear from the people on the ground, the people who are really on the front line and affected, more than anything else. And then again, this is an area where I think it's really important to have public input, because at the end of the day, these are public lands that belong to all the American people. And often, in the case of mining, it's an industry that's still governed by very old laws, old federal laws. So, I think public input is really important. And then I think I have another sort of thing that I notice I end up covering a lot and one thing that I like about covering environmental issues compared to politics, or, straight political reporting on campaigns and things of that nature, is that there's a lot of unlikely alliances that form. These issues are not Republican, or they don't fall neatly into the Republican or Democrat platform. I think in many cases, especially in Nevada, where the divides are just different. In a lot of cases, it's rural versus urban. It's in some cases it's ag versus mining. It's everybody versus the military, when they're expanding and when they were trying to expand in Fallon. And it really is different than a lot of reporting I do to see a bunch of different groups in a room together, because in campaign reporting and other political reporting, that just doesn't really happen anymore. And then my last slide is just a general kind of slide. The other stories I really see myself doing more and more often are on the intersection of water, land, and climate change. The limits that water and the effects of climate change on water pose for growth, and just increased demand on land in general. I hear about that from everybody, in urban parts of Nevada and in rural parts of Nevada. And I think I've left about 15 minutes for questions. Oh wait, I have one more slide. I just want to say, I think journalism is the starting point. As journalists, we traditionally don't do any kind of advocacy, but we do look at the impact of our stories and what people do with the information, interrogate the information, how they add to it and criticize it is really important. So after a story publishes, it's just audience engagement is really important as well. And now questions.
All right, I saw one earlier from David Pritchett, and he says, Daniel, oh, first, before we get into questions, I just want to ask everybody to stick around because I'm going to raffle off that REI flash pack that we were talking about. So stay tuned. As soon as we're done with questions, we'll get that out of the way. But David Pritchett asks, Daniel, how often and why have you needed to exert Nevada public records requests or federal FOIA requests?
I um I do from time to time. I actually I often feel that I can well, yeah, I put in state public records requests frequently. I don't do federal records requests as often, but I do sometimes as well.
All right, next question from Kyle says, how does the original water level at the lake's location, the historic levels of the Colorado, compare to now about a century after Hoover Dam was built? Would the quote unquote now level be the same?
Sorry, I cut out for a sec.
Oh, I apologize. They're just asking about how the level of Lake Mead currently compares to the original lake level after the construction of the Hoover Dam.
Sorry, I'm just so I believe the lake is about 100, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I believe the lake is about 150 feet lower than full pool. I think I am not 100% sure what that translates to as a percentage, but it's very low. I more recently looked at the combined percentage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. I'm not sure how close is it to river depth, like the bottom of the river underneath the dam, or I mean, it's pretty far because the dam is so high up. But the the thing about Lake Mead that water managers will always talk about is that with a reservoir, as it drops, the drops become more precipitous because of how because it's sort of like a cone shape. It's not just a rectangle. As there's less area as the water continues to drop. Yeah, about 35% is what I was going to guess. All
right, for the sake of the recording, I will repeat David Pritchett's question. He asks, how does your research indicate how BLM is attaining its stated goal of multiple use with sustained yield?
I think that one thing that's really interesting about covering the BLM is that it varies a lot from, of course, whoever is in office on the federal level can play a big role in the Department of Interior and in the BLM. But I also think that there is discretion within the district offices and within the state offices. And I think within the district offices, there is discretion of what to prioritize. So, I've heard that some district managers will prioritize mining over grazing, for example. So I think it varies from state, from whatever area of state you're in.
Pam asks, I believe Nevada has a greater percentage of public land than any other state. How does that factor into your reporting? Pam is correct. I think we're second in public land only to Alaska.
Yeah, I think that just plays, I mean, I think that public land plays kind of or the BLM and other agencies in Nevada end up playing an outsized role in decision making. And in some cases, people might complain about that. In some cases, I think that it can be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think that it ends up being kind of omnipresent in my reporting, as I mentioned on that slide. Like every story sort of ends up becoming a public land story, or I'll be working on a story that I think is just sort of about private development, for example, and then I'll find out that there is sort of a BLM angle, or that there's BLM involvement as well.
All right. Well, anything else?
Yeah, I was just gonna well, I had to put on my glasses because I can't read the comment chat without them. But I thought Marla Williams made a really good point about and it's something I wanted to mention when I was talking about kind of looking at the history. Looking at like the history of the law is really important to me and interesting as well, because a lot of these laws and legal frameworks that govern public land activity, specific public land activities, whether it's grazing or mining or water rights, like were enacted with different values in mind, which is a very charitable way of putting it, and excluded a lot of different voices from input on public land. So that's another thing that I'm always kind of thinking about when I look at the history. And it created a lot of pressures and tension that I think still exist on the land today about who has water rights and how water rights came to be over appropriated in certain areas. Because, like things like the Homestead Act and the Desert Land Entry Act and laws like that promoted sort of this settlement that came to be attached with water and as well. And I think you see over appropriation in a lot of different ways. And yeah. What are 3 stories? I can't talk about all the stories I'm working on right now. But I am, I'm working on a couple of stories related to the Colorado River. And I'm also working on a few stories generally related to some tensions around development and mining.
All right. Well, I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll see who the winner is of our flash pack. Let's see right here. Share that one. All right. Excuse this weird ad. I cannot get rid of it for the life of me. So. Okay, Diana Robinson. I have your email address because you're here on the Zoom call. And then, so I'll email you about getting that flash pack shipped to you or sent to you in some way. But with that, I guess we'll close it out for the evening. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And especially a huge thank you to Daniel for taking the time to speak with us tonight. Just want to remind everybody that Friends of Nevada Wilderness is a membership-based organization. Over 80% of donations we receive go directly to advocating for wilderness protection, restoring habitat for wildlife, and maintaining hiking trails. We'd love for you to become a member and join us in keeping Nevada wild and beautiful. Lastly, remember that the Wild Speaker Series is held every first Thursday of the month with various outdoors topics. Mark your calendars, excuse me, for May 5th, 2022. We will be discussing what goes into choosing photos for our highly coveted Wild Nevada calendar. Right at the same time, we'll be opening submissions of the 2023 calendar, and that will be with our very own Kurt Kuznicki, who is in charge of all of the photo submissions and getting the calendar organized. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat to that right here so that you can go ahead and take a look if you're interested and get registered. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.